After a successful decade run as a feature documentary, Eyes of the Mothman is now a podcast containing bonus information and, for the first time ever, the complete, unedited field interview tapes with eyewitnesses, experts, and those who were directly impacted by the Mothman incidents that occurred in Point Pleasant, West Virginia in 1966 and 1967. Although this podcast is meant to act as a historical record and an archive of the events that transpired, all material contained here is not for reproduction without the written consent by the copyright holder, Redline Studios, Incorporated. Welcome to episode 2 of Eyes of the Mothman, the podcast. This is going to be pretty simple. We're going to play our raw field tapes from all of our interviews with our experts and historians. They're really not in any specific order. They're going to play out in the order that we logged them back in the edit room when we cut the film. I think a lot of them will actually coincide to the order that we filmed them out in the field. Our first interview was with Jeffrey McKee. He was a professor of anthropology at Ohio State University, and this was what got the whole movie going. Do you guys remember that first interview that we did with him?
Yeah, I remember. It was the first one we did completely. It was we drove straight out to Ohio State University and sat him in front of the background of the whole school. And I remember it distinctly because it was the first time that I was really starting to understand the level of research that went into every single point of the story of the Mothman, because it took the idea that we were discussing with him of the scientific proof that somebody who could have been the prey to birds in the history of humanity. And he actually had physical proof. He had essentially a caveman's skull, a baby skull that had bird claw marks on it. And that one was when I was really like, wow, like there's some research that went into this. And now it doesn't seem like a silly kind of urban legend. It seems like we're going to really boil this down to its scientific value.
Yeah, right out of the gate, we were not like interviewing Billy Bob out in the backwoods who saw, Bigfoot.
Right.
I remember when we started to put together the idea for the movie, we definitely wanted it to be grounded in as much plausibility as possible. And I just started searching everywhere online for large birds, people who study birds, large bird sightings. There's a whole rabbit hole you can go down of people that spot prehistoric birds and pterosaurs and pterodactyls, which we got into our film a little bit, and we eventually interviewed some more people about that. But yeah, it's just it's like a breadcrumb, taking like, okay, large winged creature. You don't automatically have to go with like, is it something fantastical and something from another world? Like, what are the other plausible explanations for this? And I remember just searching out in that area for experts in interviews. There was a article in a magazine about Mr. McKee's research that he had done, I believe in South Africa, studying primates that could have been preyed on by large birds, and absolutely did. And like you said, he had, even fossil evidence that was part of his discovery. And it was just, we got lucky to where he just happened to be driving distance. So a lot of this stuff, you try to find interviews that would help tell the story you want to tell. And he just happened to be in a drivable distance and someone who could provide an interesting perspective. And we don't, I feel like what we tried to do with the movie is not be so like, this is an absolute direction we're driving you in. It's just like, hopefully you can make the association of, if a large bird at some point could have preyed on a human, attacked a human, in this time in history, just the idea that, similar things were happening in the Mothman story. And when you look at some of the cases, people would say, I saw a large winged creature, did not look familiar in terms of something that you would identify as being commonplace, and it was aggressive and attacking them. So yes, you might say also it's a loose connection, but it's also just to ground it in some type of plausibility. I remember from a production standpoint, it was really loud in that environment, and that was like our first interview, and it's like, oh damn, like you have a nice beautiful setting, but there's buses, helicopters, cars, students, which also makes it a little difficult to interview somebody. Sometimes there's so many distractions. But a few things I remember learning on that first interview, we had to drive a large distance. That was, again, we talked about it in our first episode. People would say, like, make sure you give yourself, plenty of time to get out there. It's just a straight shoot, not a single car on the highway. And so you start to learn your environment as you're making a movie like this. You're like, okay, I don't really have to worry about traffic. And so from the future interviews and dates, that became something that we learned that day. And then also we knew that we were going to return to that location for interviews. And I think after that one, we said, okay, let's try to maybe find some interior locations because this one was quite noisy.
Well, I remember being on the campus itself. They were like, oh, it's noisy, or there's a lot of people walking around. How many students belong to Ohio State? I had no idea. And they're like 78,000.
Was it that much?
That's how much it is. It's the most populous. It's usually one or two most populated universities in the country. And I'm like, that's the population of my hometown is 78,000. And so it's just massive. And it also kind of gives you the understanding about what Ohio is. It's pretty schizophrenic, not literally, but state. Whereas if you are from the eastern part, you sound like and are kind of the same kind of culture from Pennsylvania. If you're from the west side of it, you are a little bit more Midwest. If you're north, you're almost practically in Chicago. And if you're south, that's like Ohio River. You're right near Point Pleasant.
They wanted to be sure that you knew that they were not from West Virginia.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, there was that whole thing that would go on where the Ohio people did not want to be identified as West Virginians.
I am a buck.
That might have been my first time out in Ohio. Way back then. Since then we've been back I think a number of times for shoots and other things, and it's a great state, another great state to film in.
The only thing that I remember about that interview are the skulls. I just remember him showing us the skulls with the claw marks.
It's funny, as I've gone back through these interviews now, I've had to kind of revisit them and listen to them in their untouched form. And, again, just thinking back how the age that I was and where I am now and the things that you learn and you progress and get better. And even with this, I can hear my interviews getting better as they went on. Like, this is my first interview, and it wasn't bad, but it was like early. And I do also remember being really self-conscious about, reaching out to people like this. He's a professor at a major university. And I remember being worried about saying, like, do you want to be interviewed for a Mothman documentary? I never actually said that. I remember I never told them anything that this would be about the Mothman. I think later on, eventually I did. And even in our interview, like with someone like this, the whole point of interviewing him is to kind of carve out a certain subject for the movie as a piece, and not the whole. So, he's here to lend a perspective from an anthropology standpoint, from a scientific standpoint. All I really need him to do is talk about his research regarding large birds. We touched on prehistoric birds, the possibility of them continuing a lifespan into modern times, which sounds a little crazy, but and we discussed this in the raw interview. We talked about a fish. There's a fish that's called the coelacanth, and that fish is a prehistoric fish that was thought to be extinct for millions of years. And then I think in the late 90s, all of a sudden, people started catching them again. And there was like, holy shit, this was a fossil, and now it's still a living creature that had just been hiding in depths of the ocean that were not being fished, and they started to reappear. And so I remember we also discussed with him just the possibility of, like, if that can happen with a fish, could it happen with a bird? And then obviously that starts to lead to the potential explanation, or one explanation of the Mothman. Like, could this be some type of dodo bird, extinct bird that like is just reoccurring that people were seeing, and we never really fully answer any of these questions. It's just about like posing the possibility of like maybe that's what this could have been. So I remember we touched on that, which I think is interesting. I studied anthropology in school a little bit. I took a lot of electives in that, and I found that subject to be fascinating. I mean, one of the things I ended up studying was about moths and how they adapt to their environment, where moths that start to populate, like smokestacks will start to actually go from white to gray over time to not be preyed on by other predators. Like if birds are eating the white moths on in an environment that's gray and smoky, they will actually eventually start to change their skin tone to be that color to survive. And so there's some interesting parallels there, obviously, about evolution and birds. And yeah, I mean, the idea was just to try to not have this be a silly, hokey thing. Just take the subject matter as serious as possible. And he was our first interview, and it kind of, I think, set a good standard. You know, we eventually started talking a little bit about Mothman, but I didn't use any of that in the movie just because I just didn't think it was relevant. That's not what we were out there to talk to him about.
No, but I constantly use him in that interview as an example because I've watched so many documentaries on a million different subjects, and you always see this lack of responsibility. And it could be about history, it could be about politics, it could be about science. And you're just screaming at the TV like you're not talking about this, you're not asking these questions, and you can't just make these claims without something that's behind it, something that backs it up. And so, you know, I always say, look, we went all the way to find this professor, this expert, this scientist who, in this small little aspect of this urban legend about the Mothman, is to not treat it like it's just some goofy story, to break it down piecemeal. Okay, all of these claims have been made. People scoff at it. Okay, let's, look at them all individually. It's like, can there be mutations with all of this chemicals in this wetlands? And can that cause mutations of animals, et cetera, et cetera? And all these other experts and people from the government and that we've asked questions about. And so it becomes less and less ridiculous, less and less implausible when you break it down to its basic elements.
Yeah, you're trying to find some rational explanation. I mean, the idea of a flying person, that's ridiculous. But then you start to go, maybe it wasn't a person, maybe it was a prehistoric bird. Well, that's ridiculous. Well, how much ridiculous is it that a pterodactyl descendant in the lineage of that species of bird possibly could have survived? Then you start to look at the terrain of West Virginia, tons of mountains, tons of uncharted territory, Appalachia, parts that are not really inhabited by people. And then you start to go, well, again, if you hear the fish story and you're like, that's a fact, that's a real thing that happened. So if that's something that happened, how plausible is it that it could also be with a bird? I mean, the fact that they could travel large distances in a short amount of time and come and go, all of those things. It's like being a detective. You start to try to put pieces together. That's what I looked at it as. I really wanted to kind of be a journalist / detective of the case and just try to get all the evidence and present it. And you might not have a conclusion, but every possibility should have been uncovered. And I think that was part of the fun of it. One thing that we should say with it being the first kind of episode that we're going to really just dive into a raw interview. Raw interview is not going to have video. It's just going to be a video still of the subject. That's for a number of reasons, but also you don't really need it, in my opinion. It's really just to kind of give a listen. For anyone who's a really big fan of this subject matter, these interviews were really just so you can kind of sit and listen to what these people had to say. Many of them are no longer with us. So for the witnesses, for the experts, it's really just to give you an unfiltered, unbiased look at the interviews we conducted. And so we hope you enjoy this first one. That is with Jeffrey McKee, professor of anthropology, Ohio State University, and discussing the potential of Mothman possibly being an extinct species of bird.
So I'll ask you questions, but when I finally put this together in the end, no one's going to hear my question. So try to repeat it. My question, because it's like if I ask you how's the weather and it's good, then all I have is good. Whereas if you say it's good today, then it's kind of like a complete thought.
Right. Forget, just start me.
Sure. And, if you start talking and you don't like where you're going with it, or you want to, we can do it as many times as you like. It's not like live or anything.
Usually I'm live, so it's much better this way.
Yeah, it's really casual, really laid back. You can kind of do it, like I said, you can restart. You can kind of, if you need to think. However, you want to do it, it's fine. Let's shut our phones off.
Why can't the dean of my college walk by right now, Hannah?
They're in my shop. Okay, chemistry.
Okay. So, for starters, can you just tell me how you'd like me to credit yourself? If you can give me your first and last name and spell it for me, and just whatever title you'd like me to give you.
Okay, I go by Professor Jeffrey McKee, Jeffrey McKee. I can give you a card.
Okay. I was for your title, just put professor.
Professor of anthropology at The Ohio State University.
Okay, great. So, can you just tell me a little bit about your background? I guess your field of study, and a little bit about your expertise, day-to-day work.
Okay, I'm a paleoanthropologist, and that means I study human evolution and the fossil evidence for human evolution. I worked in South Africa for 10 years. Well, worked and lived in South Africa for 10 years. And excavated a number of fossil sites. One of them is the fossil site of Taung, which is about 2.5 million years old. And the other one, which I'm still working on now, is a site called Makapansgat, which is on the order of a little over 3 million years old. And there we have remains of ancient human ancestors known as Australopithecus. They were sort of ape-like creatures, except that they stood upright and walked on two legs like we do. Stood about 3.5 feet tall, so it's not this big ape man type of thing. You know, it's a small little creature, but it's our ancestor that quite literally took the first steps of human evolution by standing upright and walking on two legs. So that's the kind of thing I research. I also research the what we call the paleoecology, the ancient environment of Australopithecus and other early human ancestors, to try to build a picture of what ancient life was like. There's a bus right there.
That's the other thing too. We might do. I might ask you the same question a couple times.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we're just going to change a shot. Sometimes it's a noise. You don't have to worry about answering the same way. You can just answer naturally.
Because I never do.
If I ask you the same thing, it doesn't mean it's like wrong or something. Sometimes also, I might just look to get an answer actually in two different versions or something. Just
okay,
in
right.
Way.
That's fine.
So I'm going to ask you the same question again after that bell rings.
Yeah, it's 11:30.
Ready? Okay, we good? Okay, I'll ask you the same question. So just tell me a little bit about your background, in the type of work you do, in the field of expertise.
Okay, I'm a paleoanthropologist. I teach here at The Ohio State University and have been for 10 years. Being a paleoanthropologist means that I study human evolution. So before I came here, I spent 10 years living and working in South Africa. And there I excavated a number of fossil sites, including the fossil site of Taung, which is about 2.5 million years old, and the site of Makapansgat, which is a little over 3 million years old. And at these sites, we have quite a number of fossil species, but the most interesting ones are the Australopithecines, which are early human ancestors. When you think of an ape man, you think of these big, large creatures, but actually Australopithecus was just a small 3.5 foot tall creature. And what we study is how they evolved to become upright and bipedal. That's what actually connects them to us, is that they're bipedal or walk on two legs. Even though they had a fairly small brain compared to ours. And they were at the mercy of the elements in the past, because there are many other species of animals living at the same time that we have fossils of. There's leopards and lions and cheetah, the carnivores you have today in Africa. Plus, back then, we had additional carnivores, saber-toothed cats, very large hyenas, all sorts of things. And that is what created the atmosphere for the evolution of humans. We had to somehow survive in those environments. And
Fine.
Yeah.
I think that's good. Yeah, you could. So we're okay for that. For those first two, right? We got that kind of covered. If you and I before were talking a little bit about species that have kind of, I guess you could say, lasted past their extinction date, where it's been thought that certain species have been extinct, and then all of a sudden they pop up. And I'm not sure if how often this happens in the world of birds or not. But if you want to tie in something there that you know of, that's fine. If you want to keep it very general, that's fine.
I'll have to keep it general because I can't think of any birds that have come back.
Yeah, just to kind of, I'm just trying to make it aware to people that a lot of people don't know that fact.
Well, let me think about this first. Okay. In the study of evolution, there are a number of processes. We have new species coming about all the time, but extinction is a very important part of the evolutionary process, and animals and plants go extinct. But it's very difficult to tell when something is actually extinct. You just don't see it anymore. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist anymore necessarily. It's just you have no evidence that it exists. So there are classic examples from paleontology of species of both plants and animals that we thought were extinct. The most classic example is the coelacanth, this species of fish, fairly large lobed fin fish that we saw in the fossil record from like 80 million years ago, but thought it was completely extinct. Then off the coast of South Africa, they discovered one of these. It washed up on shore, and now we've actually had submarines go down and watch a whole colony of these deep in the Indian Ocean swimming around and surviving, even though we thought they were extinct. Now, this is a very rare thing in paleontology to rediscover a species which is extinct. And usually, if you discover something like that, it's a situation like the coelacanth, where it's in a very remote, unique environment that people don't tend to investigate very often. So it's a very, very rare occurrence that something would come back. And one also has to look at the coelacanth. The coelacanth we have today, the coelacanth we have today is not exactly like the coelacanth that lived millions of years ago. It continued to evolve, but we do have its descendants that look fairly similar in many ways. But nowadays, there are many, many species going extinct, and it's very difficult to document exactly when they go extinct because they can always be hanging out in some remote place that we haven't found them, such as the ivory-billed woodpecker, which everyone thought was extinct and might have been sighted fairly recently.
So can we talk a little more about that? Not easy to kind of declare, the species is extinct and be 100% certain, because, there are sometimes you can be surprised.
Well, the one thing that we actually expect in paleontology and evolutionary studies is surprises, because we've only been studying things for a short amount of time over the past century or so. And so each thing we dig up is something new and unexpected. And it isn't an exact science because it's difficult to declare something as absolutely extinct. So, for example, I study extinct baboons, but now someone has reanalyzed some of our fossil baboons, and it looks very closely related to some of the species of baboons that now live in Eastern Africa. Now, once again, these have continued to evolve a little bit, but they're fairly similar, and we didn't expect to see that direct of a correlation. But still, it's fairly rare in paleontology to have too many unexpected things show up. If you're dealing with millions and millions and millions of years that something's been extinct, it's highly unlikely that it's going to show up again.
Can we talk a little more about specifically about the coelacanth? For anyone who doesn't know that story, can you kind of, as if I don't know that story?
Okay. Let me just back up here, get my mind.
It was interesting the way, because I had followed that story for a while too, but I'd never even, I'd heard, they caught a dead one first that was still
that's right,
together, and that was kind of shocking. And then I believe shortly after that, within 2 years or so, they had caught a live one. All of a sudden, one day this thing has been gone for 80 million years, and all of a sudden there it is swimming in the ocean.
Okay. Once again, let me back up. I was just about to start. Okay. Yes, one of the classic examples of a species that we thought was extinct reappearing is the case of the coelacanth. Now, the coelacanth is an 80 million year old fossil. It's a lobed finned fish that's quite interesting in its own right, but it was clearly thought to be extinct. If you have a period of 80 million years, you don't expect to see something come up again. But then in South Africa, a few decades ago, one of these coelacanths, or actually the descendant of the fossil coelacanths, washed up on shore on the coast of South Africa. And that was quite the thing in the scientific world to discover this long dead type of organism, this long dead fish. Since then, they have discovered more and actually located in the Indian Ocean a very deep spot where the coelacanth lives. And they've sent submersible vessels down to film them and watch them swim around. It's actually quite fascinating to watch these lobe-finned fishes kind of lunge around deep in the ocean. They die if they come up higher in the ocean. And so that's why we don't see them very often. But if they do come up higher in the ocean and die and get washed on shore, then if someone's observant enough and lucky enough to see it there, then we have a major scientific discovery of something we thought was extinct for millions and millions of years.
Thanks. Can you talk in talking about that instinct? Can you just give me a little frame of reference? How often something like that occurs? Is this like a once in a lifetime type of thing, or is it somewhat these cases of like coelacanth existing on the whole with plants, with animals? Are these extremely rare occurrences, or are they frequent?
Yeah, the discovery of a long dead species is an extremely rare episode and a major scientific discovery as well, obviously. But it takes scientists who are very observant to be able to find these things. Sometimes they do pop up. So there are species of trees which we thought were extinct, and then we went off to Asia and found, well, actually these trees are still growing in this remote area. It's usually in the really remote areas where some long gone species, or species we thought was long gone, is still surviving, but unobserved by humans. And there are many, many species out there that humans have not yet documented. So as we go through the scientific process of documenting the biodiversity or the diversity of life on Earth, we're bound to find a few more species that we thought were extinct. But in general, it's going to be exceptionally rare.
And you had mentioned not only species that were extinct that popped up again, but that we are, I guess, constantly or frequently also discovering new species that we did not know were there.
Yeah.
I guess with the focus being on new species.
Okay.
Also new species.
Right. Now, biologists are constantly looking for new species, trying to document new species. In the Makapansgat Valley, where I worked, did my paleontology, there would be entomologists who would come up on a weekend, and they would discover on an average weekend 2 or 3 new species of insects that had never been known before to the world of science. And so biologists are still covering the world trying to discover these new species. It's not something that can happen quickly because you think about the great biologists, Charles Darwin or Thomas Huxley. They were on surveying trips, and they would take these ships on long voyages to document coastlines and things like that. Well, now, to do surveying, we can just, snap a picture from outer space. But you can't do that with biodiversity. You have to do it on foot. You cover basically the whole planet, both on land and in the water. And you're bound to find many more species that were unknown to the world of science. The larger species don't often appear as new species, but just within the last decade, there's been a couple of new species of monkeys discovered that we didn't know existed. It just takes all of that footwork to do so. We had a motorcycle and an airplane both.
That was good for that. Is there any way to really know every species of plant, animal, bird, insect that are out there? Is it kind of like a goal that'll kind of never be achieved just because it's so extraordinary what we're talking about, the scope of things?
Well, the Earth is an incredibly diverse place for life, and there's been estimated, we don't know how many species there are on this planet. There's so many. It's been estimated that it's around 12 million species, of which only about 1.5 million species have been documented. So that means that the vast majority of life out there has not been documented yet by scientists. So we would expect some surprises. The biggest surprise would be if we found nothing, obviously, but there's many, many more species. Just recently, there's been more species of monkeys discovered, and that's a fairly large animal. Normally, the species that are discovered are either ocean-dwelling species or small insects or tropical species, because the tropics are incredibly diverse in terms of numbers of species, and they haven't been investigated as much as, say, Midwestern region.
So I talked to you. I was talking before. We talked about the seal tones. And I was talking to you. I'm focusing a lot on birds, just because that I'm trying to bring some plausibility. I guess my question is, if a fish like coelacanth can manage to outlast its extinction date, is it possible that species of bird can as well? Is that possible? Is that like something? Is it fair to use those in the same respect, or is it not? Just because fish are, like you had said, in the ocean, it's kind of harder to chart those areas as opposed to. 1 second to switch there.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
It's all right.
Just fashion.
The possibility of a new species of bird being discovered is possible, but to discover something like a pterodon, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
The species of reptilian, I guess it's not even considered a bird. I don't believe I have to look into it more, but I guess in the research I've been doing, a lot of people that see these weird birds, most people, when you ask them, okay, describe what you saw, most people in the scientific world, based on the descriptions just on paper, it sounds like they're describing a pterosaur. So that's kind of where the speculations come from of, well, maybe that possibility. I guess we don't have to go that detailed into it, but I guess, just in general terms, if it can happen with a fish, if it can happen with plants, is it likely, is it possible that it can happen, I guess, with species of bird?
For a very large bird to outlast its extinction date and live beyond the time that science has documented it in terms of the fossil record is certainly a possibility, but a very remote possibility, because we study birds quite extensively, and that's probably one of the best studied organisms other than primates that exist on the planet. So it's remotely possible that something could be rediscovered that we thought was extinct. But large birds are also very, very deceptive. When you see them way up in the sky, they look fairly small, but when they swoop down right over you, suddenly you get a very, very different perspective on them. Also, being that birds themselves evolved from dinosaurs, they have this very primitive look about them. If you look at a turkey, for example, look very closely at its legs, and it looks very creepy. It looks very, very sort of dinosaur-like. And that can often fool people who don't know better to think that they have something very primitive, because they still have these very primitive feet and claws. But it's unlikely that the world of science would miss too many of these.
Do we need to do the top of that again for the bus? Okay, let's just talk. We don't have to go through the whole thing again, but just we were talking, I think.
What was I talking about?
Just in terms of, if it can happen with a fish, how likely is it to happen with a bird? You were saying that it's, I guess, possible, but not probable.
Right. Yeah, the discovery of a coelacanth was a major discovery, but one of the things that set it apart was that it was in a very remote, deep part of the ocean. For the discovery of a new type of bird, or a bird that was thought long extinct, you'd have to probably be in a very remote area.
Okay.
Okay.
But if we could, I guess more, is it just, is it possible, but
right.
How likely? Is it possible for if a species of fish can, kind of break the evolutionary kind of record there, where it's kind of 80 million years thought to be gone, and all of a sudden it's here? Can that happen in the world of birds as well? If so, how likely?
Okay. The possibility of finding a bird that we had thought was extinct for a long. There's
Wait
bus.
for that to go. Might as well.
Justin, I had it right in my mind.
Everyone's cut last today. Okay.
Okay. The possibility of finding a bird which we thought was long extinct is highly unlikely because birds are so very well studied. They're as well studied as primates, which is one of what we are. But here comes another bus. Must be the lunch bus tour.
This podcast is a companion piece to the original feature-length documentary film from 2011 of the same title. If you're enjoying this podcast, we encourage you to see the film that started it all by visiting www.eyesofthemothman.com.
Asking again?
Okay, I'm fine, I think. Okay. The probability of finding a species of bird that we thought long extinct is extremely low. One, because birds are so well studied. They're almost as well studied as mammals and primates like us. And so the scientific community has a very good grip on what birds exist and what birds do not. Moreover, birds are quite readily visible. So it would only be in the case of a bird that lived in a very, very remote part of the earth and lived in very small populations that something could reappear. That possibility always exists. That's the excitement of science, is that these possibilities always exist, but the probabilities are extremely low.
With that in mind, I guess, can you just does that add into any factors where it's a species of bird that's on a remote area, the likelihood of it being able to possibly travel out of that area?
Yeah, the fact that birds fly obviously gives them one advantage in being a little bit more cryptic, in that sometimes you cannot identify them if they're high in the sky. So if something did live in a remote area, it might not have been recognized because it's flying so high, and it could obviously, because it flies, go to a new location. So especially now as the environments change and environments are being degraded, many species are going to new environments, be they urban environments or any other environment. So it is quite possible that a bird we thought long extinct, which we hadn't really recognized because it flies high in the sky, could be looking for a new type of territory and could appear in a place where the scientific community did not expect it.
Talk a little bit about the terrain of West Virginia.
Okay. Oh, that's right. Okay. Yeah. Sure. Well, this is a very rich area for biodiversity, and because the terrain is so rough. Okay. Yeah.
Can you say either like the Ohio, West Virginia area, or name it specifically that way?
Okay. Yeah. Right. Sure. Yeah, the Ohio and West Virginia area is very good for biodiversity because it's a very rich area, very productive area, lots of water. And particularly down in southern Ohio and toward West Virginia, where it gets more mountainous, there's a lot of unexplored territory there, lots of places where one would expect to find new species that were unknown to the scientific community until now. As humans keep on expanding and pushing into those regions, we come into contact with those species much more often, and we're much more likely to see something we hadn't seen before, whether it be the casual observer or the scientific community looking for it.
Okay, I'm just going to talk a little more specifically about some of these pterosaur sightings that have kind of happened around the world.
Okay, well, the pterosaurs have been extinct for 70 million years, so it's extremely unlikely that one of them still exists and would not have been seen by the scientific community because they're very large creatures. However, it would be very easy to interpret a very large bird as something like that because birds did evolve from dinosaurs. Birds are very similar in many ways to dinosaurs, except they're basically dinosaurs with feathers. And so if you look closely at them and one swoops down very, very close to you, it's going to be easy to misinterpret it as an ancient reptile.
That's actually makes a lot of sense because a lot of people have described it as the when these sightings happen, they say it looks like a dinosaur.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any species that are kind of commonplace that come to mind that people might see and misinterpret as that? Like any that stick out in your mind? You mentioned turkey,
Turkey vultures. Yeah.
But are there any birds that stick out that people that kind of have those character traits that people might see and misinterpret?
Yeah, so around here in Ohio, we have turkey vultures, which fly around the river areas. And when you see them up in the sky, they don't look all that large. And I was trying to explain to my kids how large they were, and they didn't believe me until one swooped down and flew right over a car. And you could see it had a 6-foot wingspan. And that's very loud.
We had beeps and but so let's do that one again. You need me to ask you again? Or?
Okay. Here in Ohio, we have turkey vultures, which fly around the riverine areas. And, when they're in the sky, they don't look all that large. And so I was trying to explain to my kids how large their wingspan was. They didn't believe me until one swooped down, and you could compare its 6-foot wingspan to the size of a car that it was swooping down over. And when you see the underside of that bird, and you see the beak of that bird, it looks very, very primitive. Up in the sky, it looks very noble and soaring, but when it comes down to your level, you can see it much greater detail. It looks much more like a dinosaur.
Remember this, coming back tomorrow to do 2 more interviews. I'll have to remember to be ready for planes.
We're right on the flight path for Port Columbus.
Are we good now? Okay, so we can pick it up. You were describing, just people don't realize you see the bird in the sky. It's small, but then it swoops down. And you kind of see these detailed features of it.
Okay. Yes, when a turkey vulture is way up in the sky, it looks very majestic, and you can't fathom its size or its characteristics. But when it comes down close to you, and you can see its feet and you can see its beak, it looks very, very primitive, very dinosaur-like in many respects.
Are you, there's a lot of, like I've mentioned some of these legends of these things being spotted. Are you familiar with them at all? Like there's like, I'll give you 2 examples. There's one example like from the Civil War. There's like this photograph of these Civil War soldiers standing next to this dead, like pterosaur, pterodactyl that it's been like argued forever. Like, is it real? Is it not? They shot down the story goes that they shot down a pterodactyl during the Civil War, and there's this photo, and it's been like argued that it's been a hoax. There's been another one from France where these miners were blowing up a cave. They blew this cave up, and there was a live pterosaur that was alive for like 3 seconds. It breathed and died. And have you ever heard of any of those? Just off the camera? Have you ever heard of any?
But yeah, no, I'm not familiar with any birds that have been found. But if something did exist, it's kind of like Bigfoot. There's never a really good picture of it. There's always kind of a vague, fuzzy picture. And it'd be nice to find something like that. But it'd be nice to find Bigfoot. But a lot of these are things that are just misinterpreted and kind of blown out of proportion. So, for example, when I was living in South Africa, people would regularly bring me teeth. I said, "Oh, this is a big tooth. It might be one of our ancestors." And it would turn out to be a shark tooth or something like that. The people almost want to misinterpret things. I mean, that's why we do have legends of the phoenix or legends of the thunderbird, is because these are very majestic creatures in the sky, and we want to expand upon our notions of what they are.
Talking about the thunderbirds a little bit, you just tell me what you know about it. That's all.
I don't know.
Even if it's not much.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Thunderbirds are just simply a legend from Native Americans about a bird in the sky that creates the thunder and the lightning. And it's fairly typical. If you have a bird in the sky and you have lightning and thunder in the sky, you're going to connect the two. And so they've kind of made a causal link between the two.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit specific about the research that you were involved in regard to large birds. I guess the article I'd read, it just suggested and was speculated about a discovery of large birds, but also the possibility of them preying on people.
Yeah.
What you found?
When I was doing my excavations in the Makapanskat Valley in South Africa, I would take my young kids there, and that valley had a pair of black eagles, and my youngest son was only about 6 weeks old, and we could see these birds circling around. My wife and I would lunge in and grab our kid because I knew someone who in that same valley as a child had been attacked by the black eagles. So eagles do this kind of thing. And now my colleague here at Ohio State, Scott McGraw, has found the evidence of eagles preying on monkeys in the forests of West Africa. So it's a common thing. The eagles are carnivores. They're going to eat meat, and we are meat.
It's possible that at some point, large birds could have possibly preyed on people.
Well, large birds still can prey on people, particularly on very small people, infants and children. And if an eagle the size of a crowned eagle in West Africa can take a monkey, certainly can take a small child, because they're about the same size.
Can I ask you the same question? Can we just maybe touch on, not only is it possible that large birds have preyed on small humans and babies in the past, but even still today, we should make a connection that it's not only is it possible that it happened before, but it's still possible today.
It's certainly still possible today for large birds to prey on humans. In fact, they do prey on large humans. I've witnessed attempts at it myself, and certainly today in West Africa, the eagles are actively hunting monkeys. Certainly in the past, humans and their ancestors would have been preyed upon by large birds of prey, and that still happens today. Birds of prey still actively hunt monkeys in West Africa and in South Africa as well. And there's been many reports of eagles attacking human babies. So it's certainly still possible as it was in the past.
Is it possible that, I guess, either in present or is it more probable long ago that large birds could have been responsible for killing a human?
It's possible and indeed likely that in the past as well as today, large birds.
Speaking of large birds,
the birds of prey will fly over just the wrong moment. It is certainly possible and indeed even likely that in the past as well as today, a large bird of prey will take a human, particularly a very small human. That's a perfect size for it, just the way they take monkeys today.
can you tell me about? Okay, is that a backup? Let's do it. It's a short question. Okay, so same question.
Okay, right.
The probability of large birds taking life.
Yeah, it's possible and indeed likely that throughout the history and prehistory of humans, that a number of humans have been taken by large birds of prey. They do it today. We have evidence of them taking something the same size as an infant child, so it's very likely that they've taken the life of many a human and a human ancestor.
And can you tell me, let's talk, I guess, specifics about the findings in South Africa, skulls, and what that alludes to in terms of the deaths of the early and they're caused by large eagles.
Well, at the fossil site of Taong, we excavated a number of extinct baboon species, and one of my colleagues, Lee Berger, noticed that some of them had sort of V-shaped marks in their skulls, which is very characteristic of having been caught by an eagle. Their talons into the skull, they leave a very distinctive mark. And so certainly an eagle could have been a contributor to the fossil deposits at Taong in South Africa.
I just want to ask you, are there birds today that are capable of killing a person? Let that.
You're right. There are certainly birds today that are capable of killing at least an infant or a small child. They probably wouldn't go after a larger animal, but it's possible. Sometimes they do go after larger animals as well and then dismember them.
Can you answer that one more time and maybe give me an example of, like you mentioned, eagles?
Certainly there are large birds, particularly eagles or crowned eagles in Africa, for example, martial eagles, which are very large and they have been known to take larger prey. Usually they take smaller prey such as monkeys, and obviously they could take an infant human, but they can take larger prey as well and then dismember them.
There's pieces of birds swooping after people, but also coming down and kind of like following or going after cars. Does that make any sense? Like in terms of the nature of birds, like to hear that large birds or any birds kind of are flying with cars, over cars, kind of down swooping on cars. Like any correlation to why a bird would do that? Does it make any sense to you?
I have no idea why a bird would swoop down over a car, but birds have been known to attack people. I remember my first grade teacher was attacked by a blue jay, of all things. So it does happen. And birds will follow animals and people around that they find to be a threat or that they find to be food.
Talking about pterosaurs, actually more so glided as opposed to flapping their wings. Are you familiar with that at all?
That's the way I understand it, but I'm no expert on that. I do understand that. I mean, as I understand it, they would glide rather than actually fly and flap their wings. It was with the birds which evolved from Archaeopteryx, which was kind of a combination reptile bird, that they started the more active type of flight. But flight would have begun with the process of gliding, or perhaps not even gliding, but with just kind of helping in locomotion, just getting some extra speed.
So we're talking early birds, I guess, started by gliding and then evolved into flapping. Is that correct? Or no? You can answer just kind of off.
Yeah,
so I know
it's actually debated exactly how it evolved. It could have started by gliding, or it could have started by sort of a flapping action that wasn't meant for flight, but meant for other purposes of locomotion, speed, and effectiveness. The evolution of flight may have happened in different ways. With the early reptiles, the flight was more a process of gliding. But how in birds, starting with Archaeopteryx, which is sort of this reptile bird transitional form, how it started, it's not exactly known. It could have been a gliding process in these early primitive birds, or it could have been just a flapping process which was meant to help them in running, to help speed up their locomotion.
Are there any cases of birds that you know of a bird thought to be extinct and all of a sudden it was, it showed up?
The only species of bird I know of that was thought to be extinct, which might have reappeared, is the ivory-billed woodpecker, which they think they have discovered in remote swamplands a couple of years ago. That's even debatable now, though, as to whether or not they really did have a sighting of one.
The skull that you have there, can you just, that's kind of directly related to the research that you've done in South Africa and the findings. Can you just, show me and tell me what it is and talk about the finding?
The fossil site I worked at in South Africa, Taong, is 2.5 million years, and it's famous for the 1924 discovery of the Taong child. This is a child skull of a primitive human ancestor that stood upright, walked on two legs, had a fairly small brain, but it was the first step of human evolution, and this was the first evidence that humans had evolved in Africa, so it was a very important find. Our excavations much later in time, in the 1980s and 90s, went back to look at the site of Taong and tried to learn more about the environment in which it lived, tried to find some of the parents of this child, which we did not succeed in doing, but we did learn quite a lot about the environment and the conditions that this child would have lived in and the conditions under which it may have died. It has been hypothesized that this particular skull of Australopithecus was the victim of a large eagle, such as a crowned eagle. It doesn't have the V-shaped marks in the skull that the fossil baboons have that we had from Taong, but it does have some damage to its eye orbits, which are consistent with an eagle. There's other explanations, possible explanations for its death, but an eagle is certainly one possibility. Do I need to do it without the bells? Yeah. Okay. This particular skull of Australopithecus, this 2.5 million year old human ancestor, may have been the victim of a large eagle, such as a crowned eagle. It's been hypothesized that it is consistent with some of the other fossils we've found there, the fossil baboons. This particular skull doesn't have some of the indicators of eagle predation, such as the V-shaped marks in the skulls that we see in the fossil baboons. But it does have some damage to the eye orbits, which my colleague Dr. Berger has hypothesized is evidence of crowned eagle involvement. It's certainly consistent with that, but it's also a very thin plate of bone that could have been damaged other ways. So there's many possible explanations for the death of this child, but certainly a crowned eagle or some eagle in the past is a possible explanation for the death of this child.
Regarding the findings at that site, specifically pertaining to the hypothesis of the death by birds eagle, is there anything else there that's significant that we didn't touch on? Talk about?
Okay.
Yeah, you can start.
Okay. Well, this particular skull, although on this portion it doesn't have those V-shaped marks, we also don't have the remains of the skull itself. We just have sort of the rock filling from the inside of the skull. But certainly in the eye orbits here, there is damage which is consistent with the damage that has been found in monkeys in the Thai forest of West Africa that my colleague Dr. McGraw found. And that is damage to a very, very thin plate of bone at the base of the orbit, where it's been hypothesized that an eagle would have used its talons to kind of gouge out the eyeball and then thereby damage that plate of bone. It's also true, however, that's a very thin plate of bone and it could have been damaged by many other processes. So the hypothesis that this was caught by a crowned eagle is certainly a possibility, but not really verifiable as an absolute fact.
Is there anything else? I mean, I think I'm done. Questions? Is there anything else you want to add? That you think we left out that's important? I guess you can probably see where I'm going with a lot of stuff. Mostly the birds.
Right.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of stuff.
Yeah, we certainly did.
I guess
I can give you a whole lecture on human evolution if you like. No, thanks.
So yes, these people will come. I love evolution. Evolution was something that I didn't minor in it, but in my first college, I kind of started to study that. Those were kind of my electives.
Okay, yeah.
I loved it. I wish I had focused on it more.
For more information about our program, or to find out where you can watch the original documentary film or purchase a limited edition signed DVD copy, please visit www.eyesofthemothman.com.